Wheeler. I'm a senior on the Fairmont speech team, and my category is storytelling, which is basically, I have 15 stories that I learn before the speech season starts, and I write intros and conclusions for all of them. And the stories themselves teach people lessons. They're like little parables, but I make them entertaining. One time, my younger sister took a piece of my gum and didn't think I would notice. But then, when she was blowing bubbles, she got it stuck in her hair, so I knew instantly that she had taken my gum. Now, obviously, she was pretty embarrassed, and karma had the last laugh. In this story, you get caught gold-handed if you touch something that's not yours. The Lamb with the Golden Fleece, from the Gutenberg Project. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there lived a poor boy, and he went out and looked for a job. And eventually, he got one on a farm tending to some sheep. Now, the only tools he got was a flute and all the sheep. And so every day when he took the sheep out, he looked at the flute and wondered if he could play it, but never tried, until one day he decided he was going to. Well, I'm pretty bored anyway, so it's the first time for everything, right? Now, as he was playing the flute, he looked over and saw the only golden sheep dancing. That is not normal. Wonder if that's a usual thing. And he played the flute again, and the sheep danced again. And he thought this was so funny that he had to have the sheep. So when he took the sheep back in that night, he went to the farmer and asked him if he could have the sheep. The farmer said if he worked for him for the next year, well, then he could have the sheep as his payment. And the boy agreed, and so that's what he did. Throughout the next year, he took the sheep out into the field and brought them all back home safe and sound. And so, at the end of the year, the farmer gave him the sheep. Well, little sheep, what do you think? Is it time to go home? Meh. And so they left the farm and started walking towards the boy's house. But it started getting dark, so he stopped at a nearby farm and asked if he could stay in the barn. The farmer said he could, so the boy went out to the barn, but the farmer's daughter happened to see the sheep out of the window. Oh my goodness, that's the cutest sheep I have ever seen in my entire life. I have to have it. And so that night, when everybody was asleep, she crept out of the house and went to the barn. Hey, little sheepy, you're gonna come with me. Uh-oh, she was stuck to the sheep and she could not get off. And so when the boy woke up the next morning and saw her there, he knew what she had done, but he still tried to get her unstuck anyways, and failed. So he decided to just bring her along. Now, as they were walking to his town, he wondered if the flute would work on her too. What is happening? He thought this was hilarious. And so he kept playing the flute all the way to the edge of the town. And when they got there, there was an old baker woman who saw them. Hey, what are you doing? You look absolutely foolish. Oh, don't make me come out there and stop you. But of course, the girl couldn't stop dancing. And so the baker went out to hit her to see if she could get her to stop. And she too got stuck. Stop it! Uh-oh. Oh no. The boy saw an opportunity. This is gonna be funny. What is happening? Hey, what is this? The boy thought this was funnier than before, and so he kept playing the flute until he was almost to his house, when they were stopped by a preacher. What are you doing? Why are you dancing like that? It is not befitting. But of course, they couldn't stop. And so the preacher went out to the old lady and went to hit her on the back with his cane. But he too got stuck. Oh man, this stage just keeps getting better. Man, what is this? Hey, stop it! What's going on? The boy was on the floor laughing, and he couldn't stop laughing till he got to his house. And then he decided to go over to the old lady's house next door and asked her what had happened while he was gone. She told him that the king's daughter had fallen deathly ill, and the only way to make her better was to make her laugh. Of course, nobody had been able to do it, so the king told everyone that whoever made her laugh could marry her. Well, I think I've got just the thing. And so the boy took his circus act to the king's palace. Hey, I think I can make the princess laugh. Whatever, go right on in. Everybody's tried, but nobody's been able to. Okay, well, I'm gonna try anyways. And so the boy went into the palace and into the king's throne room, and the princess and the king were brought out. I'm gonna try and make you guys laugh, and I think it'll work. Just watch.
Man, stop it! Hey, stop it! What's going on?
The princess thought this was so funny that she laughed so hard that everyone else in the room started laughing. At that, the lamb decided to shake everyone off of him, and so they were all free to leave. And the boy married the princess, and all the people that were attached to the sheep got roles in the king's court. And so they all lived happily, unstuck, ever after. Avoiding sticky situations is not hard if you just don't touch what isn't yours.
Hi, I'm Weston Loughmiller. I'm a senior on the speech team, and I do international extemp speaking. What this is an international current events category based where you get a question 30 minutes before the round starts, and you have to prepare an outline and give the speech mostly off the top of your head. I've been doing this for 6 years, and the speech I'll be giving today is on the topic of the War on Terror. In the podcast series, The Other Latif, it details the story of Abdul Latif Nasser, a two-decade detainee at Guantanamo Bay, who was an alleged assailant of Osama bin Laden, but has been held without trial for 20 years. Abdul Latif Nasser's story is anything but far and few. Hundreds of people have been held at this prison without trial and without rights. And as we continue to see the disastrous effects of the War on Terror, it's time we ask ourselves today's question. Has the world moved on from the global war on terror? The answer is no, for 3 key reasons. First, dramatic troop removals cause a power hole in which terrorist groups fill with blood. Second, the world is dependent upon oil, and as long as that stays, terrorist groups can threaten oil fields and global security. And finally, the world cannot move on from the war on terror so long as it does not acknowledge the war crimes committed by those fighting the war on terror. So if we move on to our first point, we can see that the war on terror cannot be moved on from so long as dramatic troop removals simply embolden terrorist groups. An article published by the Wall Street Journal on January 22nd, 2021 shows that the Islamic State claimed responsibility for 2 bombings that killed dozens of people in Baghdad, Syria. This problem was exacerbated because the Trump administration, on its last day in office, had a dramatic troop removal from Iraq, leaving a hole in which the Islamic State filled with blood. But this isn't a one-off instance. This has been happening for years. In early 2019, the Kurdish people in northern Syria and Iraq had been helping us fight the Islamic State. But the Trump administration also had another significantly dramatic troop removal, leaving people in prison without anyone to guard them, and leaving the Kurdish citizens without anyone to protect them. What ensued was a massive onslaught, a genocide by many metrics, between Syria, Turkey, and Iran. Dramatic troop removals have disastrous effects in the Middle East. And if the world wants to move on from the war on terror, it needs to be strategic in how it moves on, rather than just immediately moving on and ignoring the problem. But the problem isn't only a strategic removal, it's in our energy that we use every day. The world runs on oil. Despite green energy efforts, a Forbes article from June of 2020 shows that 84% of the world's energy is from fossil fuels. And as long as this stays, terrorist groups will have the power in the world. An article published by the Council on Foreign Relations in December of 2020 shows that Iran sponsors proxy terrorist groups in order to threaten oil fields in straits such as the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, essential for millions of barrels of crude oil throughout the world. which power all of our energy supplies. As long as the world is running on oil, terrorist groups have a direct path to influence global security. If the world wants to move on from the war on terror, it needs to move to clean energy or stop emboldening these terrorist groups. But finally, we see that the only way to move on from the war on terror is to acknowledge the war crimes that those fighting the war on terror committed. Oftentimes in America, we have this idolized, heroic picture of what happened in the early 2000s. That it was a plenty of American soldiers fighting a disastrous and fundamentalist militant groups. And while there were certainly heroic actions that took place in the Middle East, there were already also some pretty atrocious ones. Case in point, the Abu Ghraib prison. The LA Times stated in 2015 that the Abu Ghraib prison was a place where prisoners and detainees were held. But not only held, they were tortured, religiously humiliated, and even mutilated. They were given absolutely none of the human rights that had been in place for decades. But the problem with this is, nobody has been held accountable. In fact, the United States specifically removes itself from the International Criminal Court in order to make sure that none of its leaders are tried for war crimes. The Abu Ghraib prison is going to continue on for much longer to come, so long as the United States and other nations in the West refuse to acknowledge the atrocities it committed. If the world wants to move on from the war on terror, it needs to understand that terror was not limited to the militant groups that we were fighting. Today, we ask ourselves the question, has the world moved on from the war on terror? And the answer is no, for three key reasons. First, drastic troop removals cause a power hole in the region, which terrorist groups fill with blood. Secondly, the world is dependent on oil, and so long as this continues, it emboldens terrorist groups to threaten global security. But finally, the world needs to acknowledge that the atrocities committed were not only on the sides of the terrorist groups. Until then, we cannot have reconciliation and move on from this atrocity. Abdul Latif Nasser sits waiting in Guantanamo Bay over 2 decades without trial, wondering what his fate is. But without a trial, we cannot even know if he was truly a part of Osama bin Laden's group or merely left up in one of his shell companies. This future of uncertainty is not alone for him. It's also the same for many millions of families stuck in war-torn countries or escaping through the sea as a refugee. If the world wants to move on from the war on terror, it needs to understand that atrocities committed were not heroic actions, but rather devastating of families.
Hi, I'm Ameya Komaragiri, a senior at Fairmont High School, and I perform in the category of great speeches. Great speeches is a category in which you select and perform sections of other people's speeches and then analyze why those sections of those speeches are effective.
Welcome to the next phase of your life. It's going to be amazing. There's a war in this country over facts and truth, and it isn't clear how it's going to play out, and congratulations. You're headed to the front lines. On May 16th of 2018, host of This American Life, Ira Glass, delivered the commencement address to the graduating class of the Columbia University School of Journalism. In this 36-minute address, the transcript of which can be found on thisamericanlife.org, Glass... I'm out of breath. Can we start over?
That's okay. That's a move.
All right, we're starting over. Give me a second.
You still want us to introduce those?
Oh, yeah.
You can do that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do that.
Take 10 seconds.
Welcome to the next phase of your life. It's going to be amazing. There's a war in this country over facts and truth, and it isn't clear how it's going to play out, and congratulations. You're headed to the front lines. On May 16th of 2018, host of This American Life, Ira Glass, delivered the commencement address to the graduating class of the Columbia University School of Journalism. In this 36-minute address, the transcript of which can be found on thisamericanlife.org, Glass prepared the students for the important task at hand, declaring that we found ourselves in the midst of a war on truth. The importance of Glass's message has only become increasingly clear in the time since his address. Today, we will analyze Glass's use of war as a metaphor, using the framework found in War Metaphors in Public Discourse by Flusberg, Matlock, and Thibodeau. In their article, the authors identify 3 essential components of the war frame, which we will analyze in Glass's address. First, the speaker must articulate the similarities and differences between a metaphorical war and a physical war. Next, the target domain must pose a real and imminent threat. And finally, the war frame serves as an initial call to action, intended to elicit an emotional response and motivate change. So first, let's analyze how Glass draws similarities between a physical war and a metaphorical war on truth. I did a fundraiser for a public radio station, and the woman who hosted it told me she heard the story we did a couple months ago on Republican Senator Jeff Flake. Producer Zoe Chase followed him for 4 months as he tried to get DACA legislation passed. The woman told me she had this feeling listening, which she described like, "No, don't make me like him." And she was like, "I didn't want it to happen, but you humanized him." And I was like, "We didn't humanize him. He is human, you know? We simply documented him like we document anyone else." Zoe presented his stubborn idealism and his flaws, argued with his premises, challenged him point by point throughout the hour, just like we would anyone else who comes on the show. The listener seemed cautiously okay with the fact that she was seeing him as a human being, seeing a Republican senator as a person. To be sure, a person she didn't agree with, but a person with principles and decency, and not a monster. In this section, Glass uses an anecdote to highlight the us versus them mentality in American politics, that we actively try to avoid seeing the humanity in those that we see as others. The example of Senator Jeff Flake shows that even when he would otherwise be considered a principled and decent human, the woman hosting the event did not want to see Senator Flake as a person. Glass warns the audience of journalists that even when they do the right thing, even when they treat all of their guests with the same levels of respect and challenge them to support their positions, many people will see the story differently because of the conflict-like mentality in American culture. Having shown the audience of journalists an example of how the war on facts and truth mentality impacts their ability to report on stories about politics, Glass builds on the war metaphor by telling a story about the real and imminent threat of false and misleading reporting. The story started with a political fight in Homer, Alaska, on immigration. Liberals on the city council proposed a resolution that would welcome immigrants into Homer, including undocumented immigrants and Muslims. Everyone in the town seemed to take a side, except apparently this one guy, Ben Tyrer, 27 years old, who was not really into the news. But now that everyone he knew was taking a side over this fight, Ben thought he should have an opinion too. And so he went on the internet and did something new for him. Ben visited news sites to figure out for himself, would it be okay to welcome immigrants into Homer? Ben read about Muslim extremists setting fire to Germany's oldest church. There's a video of them celebrating. He read about crime waves sweeping Germany and France thanks to Muslim refugees there. And after about a week of this, Ben reached his conclusion. Immigrants, especially Muslims, seem dangerous. The video Ben saw on Breitbart, of Muslim men setting fire to Germany's oldest church. Turns out the church wasn't Germany's oldest, and it hadn't been set on fire. And the men celebrating in the video were Syrian refugees, celebrating a ceasefire in the war back home. Ben was flabbergasted. He felt deceived. It had never hit me so starkly. I mean, we all know there's a massive machine churning out non-factual stories that the fact-based news media where I work doesn't even bother to combat, because there's just so many of them. And so they just stand, uncorrected. Here, Glass tells Ben's story to, as the aforementioned article, War Metaphors in Public Discourse states, draw attention to an issue and motivate behavior change. Ben Tyrer was an uninformed individual who, in an honest attempt to understand the issue of refugee resettlement, was led to be suspicious and fearful of Muslims. Glass tells Ben's story to identify the real and imminent threat that false and misleading reporting can have. And by identifying the source of this threat as something that is numerous and goes uncorrected, Glass creates a real and present danger, a massive machine for the audience of journalists to rally against. And Glass was right, that the threat of increasing bias in a culture does have serious negative implications, as an article from NPR on November 16th cites that in 2020, hate crimes rose to their highest levels in over a decade. In this final section, Glass satisfies the third and final element of the war frame by turning his war metaphor into a call to action. The people pushing untruth see this as a war. They talk about it like a war. They fund it like a war. And the fact-based news media, our people, we don't treat it like a war. And I think we need to do that, to flood the zone with money and new ideas on how to reach people and what to reach them with. I think this moment requires a strategy that has yet to be invented by people that have yet to take up arms. Because when you have one side fighting a war against an opponent who isn't fighting a war, guess who loses a lot of territory? And we have lost a lot of territory. Many people in this country do not trust us, and we have a president who calls what we do fake news. We need your ideas and energy to fight this war. And we need great reporting. In this passage, Glass makes his most direct comparison between the current state of journalism and a battlefield. Glass uses the most persuasive facet of the metaphor, urgency, to express the dire need for great reporting. Glass uses anaphora, or the repetition of words or phrases at the beginning of a sentence, to enhance the urgency of his message. In the 1965 book, Classical Rhetoric, by Edward Corbett, he notes that repetitive wording helps to establish a marked rhythm in the sequence of clauses. And this scheme is generally reserved for when the speaker wants to elicit an emotional response. Because of Glass's call to arms to motivate change and his emotional characterization of the current state of journalism, likening it to a battlefield in which the journalists are like troops heading to war, he satisfies the third and final element of the war frame. Glass was right in his account of journalism as a battlefield. First, he demonstrated how the American mentality is like that of a war, using the example of Senator Jeff Flake. Glass then went on to tell a story about the real and imminent threat of false reporting through the story of Ben Tyree. And finally, Glass gave an urgent call to action, prompting the journalist to take up arms in the fight. The war on facts and truth that Glass was talking about is still going on today. Dishonesty in American politics has led us to see those that we deem as others as monsters. Dishonest reporting on immigration has led us to see an increase in hate crimes. And unfounded claims of election fraud led to a takeover of the American Capitol and the deaths of 5 people. Glass left his audience with these final words. I really, truly, no kidding, envy you. To be starting at this time when journalism itself is changing so much. To be part of remaking it into something new. To be battling untruth with truth. Best to you all, my new colleagues.